Emily could hardly sit still. It was a bright morning, and the classroom buzzed with excitement. Sophie, her best friend, was planning a big birthday party. Everyone had been talking about it all week. Emily couldn't wait to see the decorations, eat cake, and dance with all their friends. During lunch, Sophie stood in the middle of the room, holding a stack of colorful envelopes. "I've got the invitations," she announced with a big smile. The room filled with cheers as Sophie started handing them out one by one. Emily clapped her hands softly, her heart jumping with happiness. She loved parties, and Sophie's were always the best. Last year, they had balloons in every color and a magician who made a rabbit appear out of a hat. Emily remembered laughing so hard that her stomach hurt. One by one, Sophie gave invitations to their classmates. "Here you go, Mia," Sophie said with a grin. "This is for you, no?" She kept going until almost everyone had an envelope. Emily waited, her hands resting on her desk. She kept telling herself, "It's coming. Maybe Sophie will save mine for last. That would be funny." But soon, Sophie ran out of envelopes. The pile in her hands was gone. Emily blinked, confused. She looked at Sophie, waiting for her to say, "Oh, I almost forgot yours." But Sophie didn't. Instead, Sophie turned to talk to Mia and Noah, laughing at something they said. Emily's chest tightened. Her smile faded. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Sophie had forgotten her invitation at home. That must be it. Sophie wouldn't leave her out, would she? After class, Emily walked over to Sophie. "Hey," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think you forgot my invitation." Sophie hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Oh," she said, avoiding Emily's eyes. I didn't forget. It's just my mom said I couldn't invite too many people this time." Emily felt like the air had been knocked out of her. "Oh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," Sophie said quickly, but she didn't sound like she meant it. "I'll see you later, okay?" Then Sophie turned and walked away. Emily stood there, frozen. She felt her cheeks burn and her eyes sting with tears. She quickly turned and left the classroom, not wanting anyone to see her cry. At home, Emily sat on her bed, staring at the floor. She hugged her knees to her chest and tried to make sense of what had happened. Why didn't Sophie invite me? Did I do something wrong? Her mind replayed every conversation they'd had in the past few weeks. Sophie hadn't seemed upset. They'd laughed together, shared snacks, and talked about their favorite TV shows like they always did. So why did she feel so distant now? Emily wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. The questions swirled in her head, but there were no answers. All she knew was that she felt left out, hurt, and confused. That night, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She wanted to call Sophie and ask why she wasn't invited, but she was scared of what Sophie might say. What if Sophie didn't want to be her friend anymore? As the room grew darker, Emily closed her eyes. She told herself not to cry again, but the tears came anyway. All she wanted was for things to go back to the way they were before. Before the invitations, before the distance, before the hurt. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt truly alone. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk, her stomach twisting in knots. She wanted to ask Sophie why she hadn't been invited, but part of her was scared of the answer. Still, the thought wouldn't leave her alone. She had to know. During recess, Emily saw Sophie sitting under the big tree at the edge of the playground. Sophie was laughing with Mia and Noah. Emily's chest felt tight, but she gathered her courage and walked over. "Hi, Sophie," Emily said softly. Sophie looked up, her smile fading. "Oh, hey," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "Can I talk to you?" Emily asked. Her voice shook a little, but she tried to sound calm. "Alone?" Sophie glanced at Mia and Noah, then sighed. "Okay," she said. She got up and followed Emily to a quiet spot near the swings. Emily turned to face her. "I need to know," she said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you invite me to your party?" "Really? You're my best friend. I don't understand." Sophie looked away, her cheeks turning pink. She shuffled her feet, as if trying to find the right words. "It's not me," she finally said. "It's my parents." Emily frowned. "Your parents? What do you mean?" Sophie bit her lip and took a deep breath. "They said they think you look different. They don't think you'll fit in with the other kids at the party." Emily froze. Her heart seemed to stop. "What?" she whispered. Sophie's eyes darted around, not meeting Emily's. "They said it would make things awkward," she mumbled. "I'm really sorry, Emily. I didn't know how to tell you." Emily's mind raced. Her face grew hot, and her hands started to shake. "What's wrong with the way I look?" she asked, her voice breaking. "There's nothing wrong with you," Sophie said quickly. "It's just my parents can be weird about stuff like that." Emily stared at Sophie, struggling to hold back tears. Her throat felt tight, and her chest hurt. "We're best friends," she said, her voice cracking. "How could you let them say that? How could you agree with them?" "I didn't agree," Sophie said defensively. "But what was I supposed to do? It's their house, their rules. I didn't have a choice." Emily shook her head. "You did have a choice. You could have stood up for me. But you didn't." Sophie's face turned red. "It's not that simple, Emily," she said. "You don't understand how hard it is." Emily took a step back, her tears finally spilling over. "I thought you were my friend," she whispered. "But friends don't treat each other like this." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Emily didn't wait. She turned and walked away, wiping her face with her sleeve. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Emily kept hearing Sophie's words over and over in her head. "You look different. You won't fit in." What did that even mean? What was so wrong with her? When Emily got home, she went straight to her room. She looked at herself in the mirror, trying to see what Sophie's parents might have seen. Her dark hair? Her eyes? Her skin? She didn't understand. She looked like herself, just like she always had. She sat on her bed, pulling her knees to her chest. The more she thought about it, the more the words stung. "You won't fit in." The phrase repeated in her mind until she felt like it was true. Maybe she didn't belong. Maybe she didn't deserve to be at the party. Emily buried her face in her hands and cried. She didn't know how to fix this, or if she even could. All she knew was that the friendship she'd always believed in suddenly felt broken. And worst of all, she wasn't sure it could ever be the same again. That evening, Emily sat quietly at the dinner table. Her plate of spaghetti sat untouched. She picked at her food, twirling the noodles around her fork, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Her mom noticed right away. "Emily, honey, are you feeling okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Emily shrugged. "I'm not hungry," she mumbled. Her dad looked up from his plate, concern in his eyes. "You've been quiet since you got home," he said. "Did something happen at school?" Emily hesitated. She didn't want to talk about it, but the weight of the day felt too heavy to carry alone. Slowly, she put down her fork and looked up. "Sophie didn't invite me to her birthday party," she said, her voice small. Her mom frowned. "What? Sophie's your best friend. Did she say why?" Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "She said her parents think I look different," she said, her voice breaking. "They think I wouldn't fit in with the other kids." Her dad set down his glass, his face serious. "They said that?" Emily nodded again, her cheeks burning with shame. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What's wrong with the way I look?" Her mom got up from her chair and moved to sit beside Emily. She wrapped her arm around her shoulders and held her close. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. "There is nothing wrong with you. Not one thing." "Then why did they say that?" Emily asked, tears streaming down her face. Her mom took a deep breath. "Sometimes people judge others because of how they look, where they come from, or the color of their skin," she said. "It's called a stereotype. It's when someone believes something unfair about a group of people, even if it's not true." Emily frowned. "But why? Why would they think that about me?" "It's not about you, Emily," her mom said gently. "It's about them. Some people have ideas about others that are hurtful and wrong. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It just means they don't understand how special and wonderful you are." Her dad leaned forward. "What Sophie's parents did was unfair, and it wasn't kind. You didn't deserve that," he said firmly. "You should never have to change who you are to fit in with anyone." Emily sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "But it still hurts," she said. "I thought Sophie was my friend." Her mom nodded. "It's okay to feel sad. What Sophie did wasn't right, but maybe she didn't know how to stand up to her parents. That doesn't make it okay, but it doesn't mean you're not a good friend." "I don't even know if I want to be her friend anymore," Emily said quietly. "You don't have to decide that now," her mom said. "Just remember, The way people treat you says more about them than it does about you. You are kind, smart, and beautiful, and no one can take that away from you." Emily leaned into her mom's hug, feeling a little better but still sad. "I just wish things could go back to normal," she said. "I know, sweetheart," her mom said, stroking her hair. "But you'll get through this. And you're not alone. We're always here for you." That night, Emily sat on her bed, thinking about what her mom had said. She still felt hurt and left out, but a small part of her started to believe that maybe this wasn't her fault. Looking in the mirror, Emily whispered to herself, "There's nothing wrong with me." It didn't take away all the pain, but it was a start. The next morning, Emily woke up with a heavy heart. She didn't want to go to school. The thought of seeing Sophie made her stomach twist. What would she say? How would Sophie act? Would her other classmates know? As she walked into the classroom, Emily kept her head down. She slipped into her seat quietly, hoping no one would notice her. Sophie was sitting a few desks away, laughing with Mia and Noah. Emily glanced at her for a moment, but Sophie didn't look back. During recess, Emily sat on a bench near the playground, pretending to read a book. She didn't want to run into Sophie or the other kids. She just wanted to be invisible. "Hey, Emily," a voice called. Emily looked up to see Clara and Sarah walking toward her. They were in her class, but not close friends. "Are you going to Sophie's party on Saturday?" Clara asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Emily froze, her cheeks flushing red. She wanted to disappear. "Oh no," she mumbled, looking down at her book. "Why not?" Sarah asked, frowning. "Everyone's going. It's going to be so much fun." Emily felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know what to say. I wasn't invited," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara and Sarah exchanged a surprised look. "Really?" Clara asked. "But you and Sophie are best friends." Emily shrugged, trying to hold back her tears. "Not anymore, I guess," she said softly. "Oh," Sarah said awkwardly. "That's weird." Clara hesitated for a moment, then said, "Well, we'll see you later, I guess." They walked away, leaving Emily alone on the bench. Emily sighed and closed her book. She didn't feel like pretending to read anymore. All she could think about was how embarrassed she felt. Now everyone would know she wasn't invited. What would they think? The rest of the day dragged on. During lunch, Emily sat at the end of a table by herself, picking at her food. She could hear her classmates talking about Sophie's party, making plans and sharing how excited they were. "Did you hear? There's going to be a piñata," someone said. "And cupcakes with our names on them," another added. Emily's chest felt tight. She wanted to block out their voices, but it was impossible. In the afternoon, Sophie finally came over to her desk. "Hey, Emily," she said quietly. Emily didn't look up. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold. Sophie hesitated. I feel bad about what happened," she said. "I didn't want to hurt you." Emily finally looked at her, her eyes filled with hurt. "You already did," she said, "and you didn't do anything to stop it." Sophie didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said again, then walked away. Emily watched her go, feeling a mix of sadness and anger. The apology didn't change anything. It didn't take away the pain or the loneliness. When the school day ended, Emily walked home slowly, her bag feeling heavier than usual. She couldn't shake the feeling of being left out, of not belonging. The day had been harder than she expected, and she wasn't sure when it would get better. As she climbed the steps to her house, Emily told herself she wouldn't cry again. But when she walked in her room and closed the door, the tears came anyway. She sat on her bed, hugging her knees, and let herself feel the sadness. All she wanted was to feel like she mattered again. But right now, it was hard to believe she ever would. The next day at school, Emily felt the same heaviness in her chest. She walked to class slowly, wishing she could just stay home. As she sat at her desk, she kept her head down and tried to stay invisible. But Emily's teacher, Mrs. Bennett, noticed something wasn't right. During a quiet moment in class, she walked over to Emily's desk and knelt beside her. "Emily," Mrs. Bennett said softly, "are you okay? You seemed a little sad lately." Emily hesitated. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling. "I'm fine," she mumbled, staring at her notebook. Mrs. Bennett gave her a kind smile. "Sometimes it helps to talk about things," she said. "You don't have to tell me everything. but I'm here if you need someone to listen. Emily looked up at her teacher, her eyes filling with tears. It's just, Sophie didn't invite me to her party, she said quietly. Her parents think I don't fit in. Mrs. Bennett's face softened with understanding. I'm so sorry, Emily, she said. That must feel really hurtful. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. I don't know what to do, she admitted. I feel like no one cares about me anymore. Mrs. Bennett placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. Emily, you are a kind, bright, and thoughtful person. What happened isn't about you. It's about other people's misunderstandings. But you don't have to carry this alone. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Sometimes, Mrs. Bennett said, when we feel hurt, it helps to share how we feel. When you speak up, you give others a chance to understand you better. Have you thought about telling your classmates how this has made you feel? Emily shook her head. I wouldn't know what to say, she said. You don't have to say it all at once, Mrs. Bennett said. Maybe you could write a letter. That way, you can take your time and explain things in your own words. Emily thought about this for a moment. A letter? It felt less scary than talking in front of everyone. I could try, she said softly. Mrs. Bennett smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. And remember, you're not alone. There are people who care about you, more than you might realize. After school, Emily sat at her desk at home with a blank piece of paper in front of her. She stared at it for a long time, unsure of how to start. Finally, she picked up her pencil and began to write. Dear class, I want to share something with all of you. Lately, I've been feeling really sad because I wasn't invited to Sophie's party. I found out it was because her parents think I look different and wouldn't fit in. That hurt me a lot. I don't understand why being different is a bad thing. Being different is what makes us special, right? Emily paused, her pencil hovering over the page. She took a deep breath and continued. I didn't want to tell anyone about this because I felt embarrassed. But Mrs. Bennett helped me see that it's okay to talk about my feelings. I just want you all to know how this made me feel. It's hard to feel left out, but it's even harder when people judge you for something you can't change. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she kept writing. I hope we can all try to be kinder to each other and remember that being different doesn't make someone less important. It makes them unique. When she finished, Emily read over her words. Her heart still ached, but she felt a small spark of hope. The next day, she walked into class with the letter folded neatly in her hand. She didn't know what would happen when she shared it, but for the first time in days, she felt just a little stronger. That evening, Emily sat at her desk with her notebook open. The room was quiet except for the sound of her pencil scratching against the paper. She had written a first draft earlier, but something felt incomplete. This time, she wanted to share more. Her story, her feelings, and her pride in who she was. She took a deep breath and began again. Dear class, I want to tell you how I've been feeling lately. Some of you might know that I wasn't invited to Sophie's party. I found out it's because her parents think I look different. That hurt me more than I can explain. It made me feel like I don't belong. But I want to tell you something important. I am proud of who I am. Emily paused, her pencil hovering over the page. She thought about her family, her traditions, and all the things that made her unique. With a small smile, she continued, I come from a family with a rich culture. At home, we celebrate with music, food, and stories that have been passed down for generations. My favorite is when we make sweet treats together, and my mom tells me stories about when she was my age. She always says, never be ashamed of who you are, because that's what makes you special. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she kept writing. When I wasn't invited, I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me. But now I know that's not true. My skin, my hair, and my traditions are a part of me, and they're beautiful. It's hard to feel left out, but it's even harder when people judge you for being yourself. She took a deep breath and wrote the final lines. I want everyone to remember that being different is not a bad thing. It's what makes the world colorful and interesting. I hope that by sharing this, we can all learn to be kinder and see the good in each other. Thank you for listening. Emily. When Emily finished, she read the letter out loud to herself. Her hands trembled a little, but she felt a sense of relief. She carried the letter downstairs and found her parents in the living room. Mom, Dad, she said, holding up the paper. I wrote something. Can you read it? Her mom smiled and patted the seat next to her. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. Emily handed them the letter and sat down, watching their faces as they read. Her mom's eyes glistened with tears, and her dad's expression softened into a proud smile. When they finished, her mom pulled her into a tight hug. "Emily, this is beautiful," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I'm so proud of you for speaking from your heart." Her dad nodded. "It takes a lot of courage to share something so personal," he said. "You've turned something painful into something powerful. This letter shows how strong and kind you are." Emily felt a warm glow in her chest. For the first time since the invitations were handed out, she didn't feel small or invisible. She felt seen. Her mom kissed her forehead. "You are amazing just the way you are," she said. "And I know your letter will help others see that too." Emily smiled, holding her parents' hands. She didn't know how her classmates would react, but she felt ready. Tomorrow, she would share her letter, and she would share her truth. She wasn't just writing a letter. She was standing up for herself, and that made her feel strong. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the classroom, clutching her letter tightly in her hands. Her heart pounded, and her palms were sweaty. She could feel all her classmates watching her. Mrs. Bennett stood nearby, giving her an encouraging nod. "You can do this," Emily whispered to herself. She took a deep breath and looked up. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice trembling. "I wrote something that I want to share with you." The room was silent as Emily unfolded her letter. Her hands shook a little, but she steadied herself and started reading. "Dear class, I want to tell you how I've been feeling lately. Some of you might know that I wasn't invited to Sophie's party. I found out it's because her parents think I look different. That hurt me more than I can explain. It made me feel like I don't belong. But I want to tell you something important. I am proud of who I am." Emily glanced up for a moment. Some of her classmates were already frowning, their faces serious. She could see Sophie shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes cast down. She continued reading, her voice growing stronger. "I come from a family with a rich culture. At home, we celebrate with music, food, and stories that have been passed down for generations. My favorite is when we make sweet treats together, and my mom tells me stories about when she was my age. She always says, 'Never be ashamed of who you are, because that's what makes you special.'" Emily's voice wavered as she read the next part, but she kept going. "When I wasn't invited, I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me. But now I know that's not true. My skin, my hair, and my traditions are a part of me, and they're beautiful. It's hard to feel left out, but it's even harder when people judge you for being yourself." The room was so quiet that Emily could hear her own breathing. She took another deep breath and read the final lines. "I want everyone to remember that being different is not a bad thing. It's what makes the world colorful and interesting. I hope that by sharing this, we can all learn to be kinder and see the good in each other. Thank you for listening. Emily." When she finished, Emily folded the letter and looked up. Her classmates were quiet, their faces thoughtful. She could see tears in Mia's eyes, and Noah was staring at his desk, his cheeks red. Sophie looked the most uncomfortable of all. Her head was down, and she was fiddling with the edge of her notebook. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Clara raised her hand. "Emily," she said softly, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know you felt that way. What happened to you wasn't fair." "Yeah," Mia added, her voice shaky. "You're right. Being different is what makes people special. I'm sorry you were treated like that." One by one, more classmates began to speak up. "I think it's really brave of you to share this," Noah said. "And I think you're awesome just the way you are." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had been so scared to share her feelings, but hearing her classmates' kind words made her feel lighter. Finally, Sophie raised her hand. She looked nervous as she stood up. "Emily," she said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I was scared to stand up to my parents, but that doesn't make what I did okay. I was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." Emily looked at Sophie for a long moment. She could see the guilt in her eyes and the way her hands trembled. "I forgive you," Emily said softly, "but I need time to trust you again." Sophie nodded, her face serious. "I understand. I'll try to do better." Mrs. Bennett stepped forward, smiling warmly. Thank you, Emily, for sharing something so personal and important, she said. You've taught us all a valuable lesson about kindness, courage, and the beauty of being yourself. The class clapped, and Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek. For the first time in days, the weight in her chest started to lift. She had shared her story, and her voice had been heard. As she sat back down, Mia leaned over and whispered, "You're really brave, Emily. I'm glad you're my classmate." Emily smiled. She still felt sad about what had happened, but she also felt something else, hope. Sharing her letter didn't change the past, but it made her feel stronger. And for now, that was enough. That evening, Sophie sat at the dinner table with her parents, pushing her food around on her plate. Her mind was spinning with everything Emily had said in her letter. She couldn't shake the guilt she felt. "Sophie, you've barely touched your food," her mom said, looking at her with concern. "Is something wrong?" Sophie hesitated, glancing at her dad, who had just taken a sip of water. "There is something I need to talk to you about," she said quietly. Her parents exchanged a look. "What is it?" her dad asked. Sophie took a deep breath. "It's about Emily. You remember how you said she couldn't come to my party because she's different?" Her parents nodded slowly, their expressions cautious. "Well, today at school, Emily read a letter to the class. She talked about how much it hurt her to be left out because of how she looks. She talked about her culture and how proud she is of who she is." And Sophie's voice cracked, but she kept going. "It made me realize how unfair we've been to her. What we did was wrong." Her mom's face softened, but she said nothing. Her dad put down his fork and leaned back in his chair, frowning thoughtfully. "I want Emily to come to my party," Sophie continued, her voice trembling. "I want her to feel included because she's my friend and I care about her. But I don't think she'll forgive me unless we do something to make things right." "Yeah, that's right. Sophie, it's not that simple. We were just trying to do what we thought was best." "Best for who?" Sophie interrupted, surprising herself with how firm her voice sounded. "It wasn't best for Emily. It hurt her. And it hurt me too, because now she thinks I don't care about her. But I do. I really do." Her mom placed her hand on Sophie's. "What are you suggesting?" "I think we should apologize," Sophie said, "to Emily and her parents. I think you should meet them and get to know them. You don't even know who they are, but you judge them anyway. That's not fair." Her parents looked at each other, their expressions unreadable. Finally, her dad spoke. "You're right," he said quietly. "We were wrong to judge them without knowing them. Maybe it's time we did something about that." Her mom nodded. "If Emily's family is willing to meet with us, we'll apologize. I think we have a lot to learn." The next day, Sophie mustered her courage and approached Emily after class. "Emily," she said hesitantly, "can we talk?" Emily looked at her warily, but nodded. Sophie took a deep breath. "I told my parents about your letter," she said. "They want to apologize to you and your family. They realize they were wrong, and they want to learn more about you and your culture." "I do too." Emily's eyes widened. "Really?" Sophie nodded. "I mean it. I want you to come to my party, but only if you feel comfortable. I don't want you to feel left out anymore." Emily stared at Sophie for a long moment, then said, "I'll have to talk to my parents. But thank you for trying." Later that week, Sophie's parents invited Emily's family over for dinner. Sophie was nervous as she helped set the table. She hoped everything would go well. When Emily arrived with her parents, Sophie's mom greeted them warmly. "Thank you so much for coming," she said. "We've been looking forward to this." Over dinner, Emily's mom shared stories about their traditions, their favorite foods, and the festivals they celebrated. Sophie's dad asked questions and listened closely, nodding thoughtfully. By the end of the evening, the two families were laughing together, sharing dessert and stories as if they'd known each other for years. Sophie's mom turned to Emily's parents. "I want to say how sorry we are for the way we treated your daughter," she said sincerely. "We were wrong to judge her, and we're so grateful you gave us a chance to learn. Emily is a wonderful girl, and we're so happy Sophie has her as a friend." Emily's dad smiled warmly. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "It means a lot to us. We all make mistakes, but it's how we move forward that matters." As the evening came to an end, Sophie walked Emily to the door. "I'm really sorry for everything," Sophie said. "Thank you for giving me another chance." Emily smiled softly. "It'll take time," she said honestly. "But I'm glad we talked." For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was a step toward making things right, and that gave her hope.